The evening air was still as Officer Brad's patrol car cruised down the quiet street. His eyes locked onto a sleek black sedan at a red light. Expensive, polished, too nice for this part of town, at least that's what he thought. The driver was a black woman, composed and confident. Something about that unsettled him. Flipping on his lights, he pulled her over. As he approached, she rolled down the window, her expression unreadable. "Is there a problem, officer?" Her voice was calm, controlled. Brad leaned in, scanning her car. "License and registration." He didn't answer her question. She met his gaze, not with defiance, but with a quiet strength that made his chest tighten. "May I ask why I was stopped?" His patience thinned. Something about her unwavering composure irritated him. He didn't know it yet, but this moment would change his life forever. Brad's grip on his belt tightened. He was used to people looking nervous, scrambling for explanations, but this woman? She was too calm, too certain. It made his pulse quicken. "I said license and registration." His voice was sharper now. The woman tilted her head slightly, studying him like she was the one in control. Without breaking eye contact, she reached into her purse and handed him her documents. "Here you go." He glanced at the ID. Danielle Carter. The name meant nothing to him. Yet. Brad inspected the paperwork, searching for something, anything, to justify his suspicion. But everything was in order. No violations, no reason to escalate. And still, a strange frustration bubbled inside him. "You shouldn't be driving a car like this around here," he muttered under his breath. Danielle folded her arms, a knowing smile tugging at her lips. "That was a mistake," Brad scoffed. He had no idea how right she was. Brad barely had time to process Danielle's words before his radio crackled. Backup was arriving. Good. Maybe then she'd realize who had the real authority here. Two patrol cars pulled up, their tires crunching against the pavement. Brad straightened, expecting support. But as soon as the officers stepped out and saw Danielle, something shifted. Their expressions tightened. A flicker of recognition passed between them. One officer hesitated before stepping forward. "Ma'am, are you all right?" His voice lacked the usual firm tone. It was careful, respectful. Brad frowned. "Ma'am?" Since when did his colleagues address civilians like that? His eyes darted between them, confusion creeping in. He expected them to ask him what happened. Instead, they avoided his gaze. Danielle hadn't moved. She simply adjusted her sleeve, then exhaled slowly. "I'm fine," she said. Brad's stomach nodded. Who was this woman? And why did it feel like he'd just made the biggest mistake of his career? Brad's confidence wavered as he scanned the faces around him. The tension was thick, unspoken, but undeniable. The officer who had addressed Danielle took a cautious step forward, his throat bobbing as he swallowed. "Sir, that's Danielle Carter," he said quietly, as if the name alone carried weight. Brad blinked. So? The name meant nothing to him. But then, the officer's next words sent a chill through his spine. "She's the new head of internal affairs." The world around him seemed to tilt. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. Internal affairs? The very division that investigated police misconduct? His breath hitched. Danielle took a step closer, her gaze steady. "Now that you know who I am, does that change anything?" Her voice was smooth, measured. Brad opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His hands, once firm on his belt, now felt awkward. For the first time, he wasn't in control. Brad's chest tightened, his mind racing as Danielle's words sank in. The weight of her position hit him like a punch. He had just slapped a woman who had the power to dismantle his entire life. Panic gnawed at his insides. You can't just," he stammered, his voice faltering. "I didn't know who you were." Danielle's gaze didn't waver. "So if I weren't in internal affairs, it would have been okay for you to hit me?" Her tone was calm, but it sliced through him like a blade. His hands shook slightly as he tried to grasp at his words, but they felt hollow, meaningless. The arrogance he had carried so effortlessly moments ago crumbled. There was no escape from the truth. He had made a dangerous mistake. Danielle's eyes locked with his, her voice icy. You've crossed a line, and now you'll answer for it. Brad's mind raced as he stood there, frozen, unable to escape the reality unfolding around him. Danielle's calm, unshakable presence stood in stark contrast to his rising panic. He knew without a doubt that this was the end. He turned to the other officers, his voice rising in desperation. You can't let her do this. She's just a civilian. I'm the one in charge here. His words were met with cold silence. But then the quiet order came. Sir, step away. The officers had no hesitation. They moved quickly, efficiently, handcuffing him with the same practiced ease that he had once used to arrest others. The irony wasn't lost on him. His breath hitched, his heart pounding as the weight of his actions closed in. The flashing red and blue lights of the patrol car seemed to mock him. Karma had come for him, and there was no escape from the consequences. Brad's legs felt like lead as they guided him toward the patrol car, the cold steel of the cuffs biting into his wrists. The air around him seemed to grow heavier, each step towards the car echoing in his ears like the beat of a drum, louder with every move. He could feel the eyes of his fellow officers burning into him, their silence louder than any accusation. No one spoke, but their avoidance of his gaze spoke volumes. His chest tightened with humiliation. The reporters had arrived, their cameras flashing, capturing every moment of his downfall. He lowered his head, wishing he could disappear. The officers led him toward the car, his mind reeling with the consequences of his actions. Every second of this walk felt like an eternity. The woman he had just tried to humiliate now stood in the shadows, watching him with quiet, unspoken authority. He was no longer in control. She was as Brad was shoved into the back of the patrol car, he felt the cold, unyielding metal of the door slam shut behind him. The reality of his situation washed over him like a wave. He wasn't just a cop anymore. He was a criminal, a disgrace. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, suffocating him with regret. He had acted on impulse without thought, without understanding the power of his position. And now he was paying the price. He could still see Danielle's eyes, sharp and piercing, holding a mixture of disappointment and authority. She wasn't just an officer, she was his reckoning. The silence in the back seat was deafening. His thoughts spiraled, replaying every moment, every wrong decision that had led to this. He had underestimated her. And now that mistake would cost him everything. Danielle hadn't just shown him who she was. She had shown him who he had become. The days blurred together until Brad found himself sitting in the courtroom, the heavy air pressing down on him. His hands, now free of the cuffs, were clammy with nervous sweat. Every glance from the people around him felt like a searing burn, but none were more intense than the one from Danielle. She stood tall at the front, her presence commanding the room. As the case unfolded, Brad's guilt weighed on him like an anchor. The prosecutor painted him as a man who abused his power, a cop, too blinded by arrogance to see the truth. He had no defense. His own actions condemned him. But then, when it was time for Danielle to speak, she didn't just recount what happened. She didn't just outline his wrongdoings. She looked at him, her eyes soft, but filled with something far stronger than anger: forgiveness. In that moment, Brad realized how far he'd fallen, and it broke him. Brad's heart pounded as Danielle spoke. Her words weren't filled with hate or vengeance, they were steady, almost sorrowful. "No one is beyond redemption," she said, her voice echoing in the courtroom. It was then that Brad realized this wasn't about his punishment. It was about his chance to change. The woman he had wronged wasn't asking for his life to be destroyed. She was giving him a choice to rebuild it. But as his guilt flooded him, Brad knew there was no easy path forward. The price of his actions was high, but the road to redemption lay ahead, if he was brave enough to take it. As the trial drew to a close, Brad's gaze locked with Danielle's one last time. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. What would you do if given a second chance? Share your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more real stories of change.